story begins with a phrase that appears repeatedly in 3 letters written by residents at the time, always with the same construction, as if someone had decided to establish, once and for all, the truth about something that no one could explain. What disappeared at the top of Linha de Madeira was not just a family. It was an entire piece of winter. It is from this sentence that the elderly researcher begins his account. He had been studying the events of 1897 in the Ashbrook Hollow region for over 20 years, collecting testimonies from descendants, consulting records in the old county courthouse, and analyzing dozens of pages stained by moisture, where the text dissolved as if time had blown sand over the words. With each new discovery, there was more silence than clarity. The Ashbrook family consisted of Samuel and Marianne, both in their 40s, and their 2 children, Elias, 15, and Ruth, 13. They lived on a small property nestled in a fold of the mountain range, a remote stretch of the Appalachians where the fog seemed to linger between the slopes, as if it had learned to move slowly so as not to frighten anyone. It was a region known for its long winters, narrow trails, and a kind of silence that, according to old accounts, resembled that of an abandoned church. The Ashbrooks kept a small iron shed, a reinforced shelter, where Samuel stored tools and supplies used by the lumberjacks, who worked further up the timberline. The shed was unusual for the time, too solid, too heavy, with reinforced doors that looked more like part of a railroad depot than an isolated rural property. Still, no one in the area found it strange. Samuel was known as a stubborn man who preferred to prepare for anything rather than rely on the help of neighbors. The local community, made up largely of migrants of German and Scottish origin, described the family as reserved but proper. The children studied when they could, helped with the farm work, and Marianne was remembered for her skill in sewing clothes that were so well made that they lasted longer than the seasons. It was common to see her on Sunday mornings walking to the small chapel in the valley, always with a light blue scarf covering her hair, a gesture that many compared to the habit of women in older villages. In the winter of 1897, however, something changed in the way the family was perceived. Some reports collected by the researcher mention that Samuel seemed to carry a new weariness, while Marianne avoided conversation and kept her eyes on the ground. Other residents claimed that Elias, the eldest son, had been seen several times at dawn, walking near the forest trail, as if waiting for someone, or avoiding meeting someone. These details, although vague, appear repeatedly in different field notebooks from that time, noted by itinerant teachers, merchants, and even a young pastor who used to visit the most isolated families. Further up, on the Linha de Madeira, 22 lumberjacks hired by a local company were working that year. Despite the long distances and harsh winter, there was an informal understanding. When the snow closed the roads, some of them would descend to the Ashbrook property to take shelter in the iron shed, where they could light a small furnace and share dry food. The presence of these men was frequent enough that many believed that the family and the group maintained a kind of silent and functional coexistence. But a specific document caught the researchers' attention decades later. It is a letter signed by one of the supervisors of the logging company, dated February 18, 1897. In the letter, the man stated that Samuel Ashbrook had requested, with unusual urgency, that the loggers not approach the shed for a few days. This seemingly trivial note contrasted with other records showing that the shed was vital to the group's safety, preventing them from getting lost in the snow or suffering from extreme temperatures. The letter ended with a sentence that the researcher has underlined several times over the years. He said he needed time to fix some things inside. He seemed distressed. The problem is that no other source from that time explains what needed to be fixed, nor why Samuel's distress would be enough to keep 22 men away from their only viable shelter. In the archives after this letter, there is only an abrupt jump to the statements taken weeks later, when the disappearance of the family and the woodcutters had already become the talk of the entire county. Before that, the historical record dissolves into gaps, ink stains, and contradictory accounts. And it is precisely in this gap, silent, strangely precise, that the mystery begins. The researcher leans over the papers and concludes this introduction by noting that what came next transformed the iron shed into more than a shelter. It made it a landmark of silence. And that's where this archive really opens up. The researcher often says that to understand any disappearance in the Appalachians in the 19th century, one must first understand everyday life, the slow, almost ritualistic pace that shaped the lives of isolated families. In the remaining records about the Ashbrooks, this daily life appears fragmented, but still consistent enough to reconstruct the atmosphere of the months leading up to 1897. The property where they lived was on a gentle hill, from which you could see the dense forest forming a natural corridor to the timber line. Every morning, before the sun could break through the fog, Samuel would go out to check fences, collect firewood, and walk to the iron shed. According to a statement given decades later by one of the neighbor's descendants, he made this journey with clockwork precision, never missing the same schedule. This habit only began to change in early January of that year, when his routine began to show small breaks, delays of minutes, detours, unexpected returns home. Marianne, for her part, was remembered as a woman who balanced firmness and delicacy. She spent much of her day sewing, mending work clothes for the woodcutters, and preparing simple meals: dark bread, boiled potatoes, thick soups that helped ward off the persistent cold. In her recipe book, found years later by a distant niece, there are brief notes about the growing difficulty of keeping the pantry stocked. One excerpt, written in careful handwriting, reads, "Winter has returned earlier than expected. Samuel seems worried but won't say why." Elias and Ruth grew up in an environment where childhood was shaped more by nature than by social expectations. The boy helped his father with the planting and, whenever he could, accompanied the woodcutters on the easier stretches of the trail, an activity that, according to reports, strengthened his self-confidence and sense of responsibility at an early age. Ruth, on the other hand, preferred to stay by her mother's side, learning to sew and jotting down little observations about visitors in the notebook she always carried with her. This notebook disappeared along with the family and was never found, although some researchers claim to have seen excerpts reproduced in private documents that were never officially released. At the end of 1896, the presence of the 22 woodcutters became more frequent. The winter had been harsher than expected, and the logging company demanded more production before the snowstorms blocked access for good. This brought the men even closer to the Ashbrook property, using the shed as a refuge for quick meals and protection from sudden storms. Some valley residents recall that despite the social distance typical of the time, the loggers maintained an evident respect for the family, especially Samuel, whose serious demeanor dissuaded them from excessive joking. But among these accounts, there are also divergent notes. A merchant who visited the region every 3 weeks wrote in his diary that, on one occasion, he found the shed closed before dusk, an unusual time since the loggers were still coming down from the timberline. When he asked why, Samuel gave him a short, curt reply: "Not today." The merchant did not insist, but noted that the man's expression was not one of irritation, but rather of someone carrying a burden that was difficult to explain. The researcher compares these accounts with the few surviving photographs of the property: frozen fields, trails covered with compact snow, and the shed, always the shed, looming in the background like a structure out of place with the rest of the landscape. It is as if it had been placed there by another era or for another purpose. There are rust marks on its sides, but also metal reinforcements unusual for a rural building. Some long-time residents said Samuel was a man of inventions, though they never explained what kind of invention would justify that structure. Throughout this period, the Ashbrooks began to record fewer interactions with the community. Marianne reduced her visits to the chapel. Elias stopped accompanying the woodcutters in February. Ruth was seen crying near the stream by a neighbor who reported the episode in a notebook handed over to the researcher years later. In this notebook, the neighbor writes, "The girl seemed to be carrying something she couldn't name." Another important fragment comes from an itinerant teacher who visited isolated homes to ensure that children continued to study. In his February note, he describes the strange feeling of entering the Ashbrook residence. The environment was clean, organized, but there was an absent air, as if the family were only physically present. Samuel avoided looking me in the eye. Marianne offered tea, but she was shaking slightly. The children remained silent. Something seemed out of place, off-kilter. None of these accounts directly describe a danger, but they all converge on a growing sense of unease, as if the family were preparing for something or reacting to something they didn't want to discuss with anyone. In the county archives, there is also a little-known document, found by the researcher in an uncatalogued box, an unsigned note, probably from one of the woodcutters. The paper, almost illegible, contains a phrase that the historian has never forgotten. If he closes the shed again, we will have nowhere to stay, and he knows it. This note, vaguely dated February 1897, coincides with the last month in which the family was seen with absolute certainty by more than 3 different witnesses. The emotional climate surrounding the property thus seemed to have become fragile and unstable. Samuel seemed torn between protecting something and pushing everyone away. Marianne seemed to carry a silent fear. The children, although less mentioned, left traces of unease. And the woodcutters, these men accustomed to dealing with risks, began to realize that the shed, once a reliable shelter, was becoming a point of tension. It is in this scenario, with routines worn down and the temperature dropping faster than expected, that the narrative approaches its breaking point. For it was precisely at the end of that winter that everyone, family and woodcutters, would abruptly disappear, leaving only fragmented traces that decades later still defy any simple explanation. The researcher always describes the 3rd week of February 1897 as the point at which winter stopped just punishing and began to close paths. It was common in that region for the snow to increase suddenly, transforming usual trails into white corridors where even sound seemed slower. But in the records for that year, there is a strange succession of notes about exceptionally quiet nights, as if even the animals had retreated far from the timberline. The last set of confirmed reports begins on February 21st, when 3 residents saw smoke rising from the iron shed. This was not unusual. Woodcutters often lit the internal furnace to cook or keep warm, but 2 of the residents claimed to have seen only Samuel outside, walking in slow circles, as if measuring steps or calculating distances. The 3rd witness, a woman on her way to a friend's house, reported hearing metal being dragged, but was unable to locate the exact source of the sound. On the 22nd, the snow increased. The researcher gathered reports indicating that the 22 woodcutters left the timberline earlier than usual, precisely to avoid being trapped at dusk. This is where the reconstruction of the facts begins to become fragmented, as different testimonies point in different directions. Some claim that the loggers went directly down to the Ashbrook property. Others say that part of the group tried to go down a side trail. There is, however, one consistent detail. Everyone was looking for safe shelter before nightfall, and this is where the most sensitive information in the files comes in. The shed was locked from the inside, according to 2 statements taken weeks later. The reconstruction of the night follows a pattern repeated in different documents. The wind began to pick up around 5 in the afternoon, blowing sharply, almost horizontally. The fine snow turned into dense flakes that hit the trees with a dull thud. The researcher describes it as the kind of night when any Appalachian man knows he needs to find shelter immediately. Some loggers, already exhausted, arrived at the property first. The footprints of these men were found later, partially covered with ice, indicating that they had walked to the shed door. But what no one can explain, and what appears repeatedly in statements, is that there were no signs of forced entry. No blows to the door, no effort to break the lock. This is especially strange because those men were known for their physical strength and ability to improvise in extreme situations. Reports suggest that those who arrived first knocked on the door, called Samuel, and got no response. Minutes later, the rest of the group began to approach along the trail. One witness claims to have heard muffled voices, but could not tell if they were from the family or the woodcutters. Meanwhile, inside the Ashbrook home, the scenario remains almost entirely based on assumptions and fragments. A notebook belonging to a traveling teacher indicates that same afternoon, Marianne and the children were seen carrying blankets and something wrapped in thick cloth, walking toward the shed. Other residents say they heard the girl Ruth calling for her brother, mentioning something like, "He can't stay there alone." But these observations have no exact time, which makes it difficult to fit them into the timeline accurately. By around 6 p.m., the snowstorm had become severe. Visibility was so low that even those who were just a few meters away from the building could not distinguish who was moving inside. One of the documents most cited by the researcher is a letter from a young resident who lived about a kilometer from the property. He reports seeing in the distance a flickering light coming and going from the shed, as if someone were walking around holding a lamp, deliberately avoiding stepping completely outside the structure. This letter contains a phrase that the researcher often highlights. It seemed as if the light was hesitating, as if the person carrying it did not want to be seen. After 6:30 p.m., everything becomes speculation. The snowstorm worsened. No one in the area dared to go outside. But surprisingly, some notes indicate that someone walked to the Ashbrooks' house that night. Footprints were found days later, heading toward the front door and back to the shed. It is not known whose they were. There was no blood, no signs of a fall, no scratches on the wood. Just that trail of solitary footsteps disappearing into the accumulated snow. At 8 p.m., according to reports collected decades later, the last known noise echoed across the hillside. A metallic crash, loud enough to be heard by distant residents, but muffled enough that no one could identify its exact source. Some said it came from the shed, others from the opposite direction. The researcher admits that this is the most difficult point to interpret, as storms can alter the propagation of sound. After that, complete silence. No lights, no movement, no voices. The dawn of the 23rd brought a deceptive calm. The snowstorm had passed, but the cold wind seemed to have frozen the air in a state of limbo. The first to climb up to the property were two neighbors who were concerned about the absence of smoke from the chimney. They found the door of the house ajar, as if it had been left that way in a hurry. Inside, everything seemed to be in place. Dishes drying next to the sink, 2 mugs with traces of tea darkened by time, Marianne's coat folded over a chair. No sign of a struggle, no objects knocked over. What caught their attention was not what was there, but what was missing. The family's 4 pairs of boots were not in the entrance. Meanwhile, other residents went to the iron shed. The gate was unlocked, but the furnace was out, and there was not a single item out of place. Nothing broken, nothing displaced, no clear traces of the woodcutters. And then came the detail that the researcher describes as the gravitational center of the mystery. The footprints leading to the shed ended right at the door. There were no footprints coming out of it. Not from people, not from animals. The snow around it was untouched. This fact, confirmed in 3 different documents, is what makes the disappearance so baffling to scholars to this day. The 22 woodcutters, the Ashbrook family, they all seem to have arrived at that point, and from there they simply ceased to exist in the records. The researcher ends this section with a sentence underlined in his manuscript. The last confirmed evidence is just an open door in front of a field with no footprints. And it is this door, remaining open on the frosty dawn of 1897, that divides the case between what is known and everything that has never been explained. With the door of the house ajar and the shed silent, the case ceased to be just a strange episode and became the most disturbing event recorded in the county that decade. The researcher often says that disappearances do not begin with the search. They begin the moment normality is perceived as an absence. And on the morning of February 23, 1897, that absence had weight, form, and a cold that seemed to penetrate clothing. The first groups of residents organized improvised searches. Men experienced in trails, accustomed to risk, spread out across the hillside in an attempt to find footprints, scraps of fabric, any trace that might indicate the direction taken by the family or the woodcutters. But what they found was illogical terrain. The snow revealed interrupted trajectories, marks that ended before they made sense, strangely smooth areas, as if something had smoothed the ground evenly. This anomaly appears in several reports. One of the oldest documents describes that the early morning wind seemed to have moved in circles, erasing footprints in patterns that did not match the direction of the previous night's gusts. Another record, from a farmer who helped with the search, states that he found wide, parallel tracks, but could not confirm whether they were from makeshift sleds, dragged logs, or just shadows in the snow. Meanwhile, the interiors of the house and shed remained intact. The county's official investigator, a methodical man, not given to speculation, noted that he had never seen such an organized residence at the center of such a serious event. He wrote, "It doesn't look like abandonment, it looks like a pause." The researcher highlights this phrase because it is repeated in a similar way in letters from neighbors who recall the feeling of entering the Ashbrook home during the search. The tidy table, Marianne's scarf on the chair, Ruth's missing notebook, the tools lined up in the shed. Everything suggested continuity, but that continuity had been interrupted. As the hours passed, news of the disappearance of the 22 woodcutters began to spread rapidly to other locations. Railroad companies, merchants and workers in the region knew that the timber line was essential to the local economy. Losing so many men at once was unthinkable. The supervisor who had received Samuel's letter weeks earlier was one of the first to arrive. He observed the shed for several minutes before entering and, according to his account, felt a thick, stagnant air, as if the place had been closed for a long time and not opened hours before. This detail is small but important. All accounts agree that the interior of the shed was too cold, as if the furnace had been extinguished long before the previous night. But this observation contrasts with another testimony, that of a neighbor who saw light flickering inside. The researcher in reconstructing this discrepancy suggests that testimonies from snowy nights may distort distances. Still, the contrast remains one of the most intriguing gaps. As the days progressed, the search intensified. Old maps show concentric circles of search patterns covering trails, clearings, ravines, and areas near the stream. What the search found, however, were only loose fragments. A piece of light blue fabric, similar to the scarf Marianne used to wear. It was found stuck to a bush, but with no signs of violent tearing. It looked more like fabric left behind by the wind than torn off. A woodcutter's axe, buried in the snow about 50 meters from the shed. The blade showed no signs of recent use. The wood of the handle was cold and hard, as if it had been there longer than the interval between the disappearance and the discovery. A set of double footprints, small and parallel, which probably belonged to the children. These footprints, however, ended abruptly before reaching the main trail. None of these findings offered a clear direction. They were loose traces, without a narrative, like pieces of two different puzzles mixed together on the same table. The statements collected later also reveal internal tensions within the community. Some believed that Samuel had decided to take his family away, fleeing from some unshared concern. Others claimed that the woodcutters could have split up and followed different routes. But these hypotheses became fragile in the face of the central fact. There were no traces of departure. The most shocking revelation of this period, however, came from the account of a woodcutter who was not present on the night of the disappearance, a man named Cormac Henson, who had been sent days earlier to fetch supplies in the neighboring town. Upon returning and discovering that his colleagues had disappeared, Henson went to the search site and, after walking around the area surrounding the shed, said something that was immediately recorded by one of the officers. "They were here. I know how men walk when they are tired. I know when they are afraid. They came to this point and stopped. Something made them stop." The researcher points out that Henson did not say this out of fear or mystery, but with practical conviction, the result of years of work. For him, the crucial detail was not what was missing, but what was left over. Abruptness, interruption, silence. a silence that appeared as the protagonist in all the documents from that week. At the end of the official search, all that remained was a report containing the most sober conclusion possible for something so vast and so empty. There is no evidence of movement after arrival at the shed. The weather prevented the collection of conclusive evidence. This statement, although correct by the standards of the time, did not close the case. On the contrary, it opened a historical wound that the researcher would try to understand for decades. The community, in turn, reacted in different ways. Some began to avoid the area. Others tried to reinterpret the events, creating theories that added nothing to the records. There are reports of families who moved away because they could not bear the feeling that something so big could simply disappear. The logging company reluctantly replaced the workers, but never regained the pace of that winter. Over time, the Ashbrook property was abandoned. The house collapsed a few years later. The shed lasted longer, but was eventually overtaken by rust. And even decades later, any account of the region always returned to the same point: the night when 26 people reached the end of the trail, and none returned. The researcher ends this section with an observation that reads like a plea to the archives. No clue disappears completely. It just waits for the moment when someone reads it with different eyes. And it is precisely the reading of these clues, decades later, that will allow for a final reflection on the case. Not to explain it, but to understand what it left behind. The researcher, already elderly when he finished his last notes on the Ashbrook case, wrote as if trying to tie together threads that time insisted on unraveling. He knew he would not find definitive answers, and perhaps this lack of a solution was precisely what kept the case alive. For him, investigating the events of 1897 was less a search for explanation and more an exercise in listening to the silence of the records, listening to what the documents do not say, listening to how the past continues to breathe, even when everyone involved is gone. Decades after the disappearance, the valley where the Ashbrook property once stood has become just an indistinct fold in the landscape. The forest has advanced, covering trails, degrading fences, erasing any human trace. The iron shed, which for so long seemed more resistant than history itself, rusted from the inside before collapsing. Today, anyone walking through the area would be hard-pressed to recognize where the house once stood or where the woodcutters used to stop to warm their hands. But in the archives, the case remains vivid. The researcher liked to say that disappearance is never the end. It is the beginning of an expanding void, and it was precisely this void that he studied. In his final notebooks, filled with shaky handwriting, there are no accusations, no spectacular theories, no attempts to reconstruct an imaginary culprit. There is only the mature contemplation of someone who spent his life trying to understand what it means to disappear in an era marked by the harshness of nature and human fragility. He describes how, over the years, he realized that the Ashbrook case was not just about the family and the 22 woodcutters. It was also about the community that was left behind, about the people who continued to live with the feeling that something had slipped through their fingers, about the neighbors who remembered the last time they saw Marianne walking with her light blue scarf, the children holding notebooks that were never found again, the loggers coming down the trail tired but still familiar. All these memories, preserved in fragments of notebooks and testimonies, created a human mosaic that the researcher treated with deep respect. One of his favorite accounts came from a resident who, now very elderly, said that on the morning after the disappearance, when she saw the empty house, she felt as if the snow were holding its breath. This kind of description does not appear in official reports, but for the researcher, it was precisely where the story became real, in the feelings that survive even when the facts fall apart. As time passed, he realized something even more significant. The absence of direct answers turned the Ashbrook case into a mirror in which each generation projects its own concerns. For some, it is a story of people trapped by nature. For others, it is a lesson in how rural communities deal with the unexpected. And for a few, it is a reminder that not everything can be organized, classified, or closed with definitive conclusions. In the last pages of his manuscript, the researcher writes a reflection that seems directed not only to scholars, but to everyone who at some point has tried to understand why certain events resist oblivion. History remains silent where life has kept suffering. And perhaps it is our task to approach this silence not to break it, but to honor it. He mentions that after 40 years of studying the case, he has never been able to free himself from the image of the shed door opening on the morning of the 23rd. Not because it hides a secret, but because it symbolically reveals what it means to live in the face of the unknown. An open door facing a field without footprints, a space where the trail ends, but the question begins. The researcher closed his file with one last visit to the site, already at the end of his life. He walked with difficulty across the ground covered with dry leaves, felt the cold wind coming down the slope, and stopped where he believed the shed had been. Nothing remained. No metal, no stone, no mark. But he wrote that, for a moment, he could almost imagine Samuel, Marianne, Elias, and Ruth sitting in front of the furnace, talking quietly as the storm raged outside. He could almost hear the footsteps of the woodcutters coming down the trail, the sound of their boots sinking into the snow, the crackling of wood in the intense cold. Almost. In the last line of his manuscript, the researcher leaves not an explanation, but a feeling, a sentence that, according to him, sums up everything he found and everything he lost while studying the Ashbrook case. There are stories that don't end. They just cease, as if the world exhaled and never inhaled again. And that is how this case remains, suspended in the cold air of the Appalachians, intact in its absence, preserved in silence.